The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty street of Redemption Falls as 22-year-old Henry Hank Morrison mucked out the stalls at Brennan's livery stable, his worn hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this thankless task for the better part of a decade. The smell of horse manure and hay had become so familiar that he barely noticed it anymore, though the town's more refined citizens never failed to wrinkle their noses when he passed. Hank had arrived in Redemption Falls as a 12-year-old orphan, alone and desperate after his parents died in a wagon accident on the Oregon Trail. Old Brennan had taken him in out of necessity rather than charity, needing cheap labor for his expanding stable business, but unwilling to pay wages that would attract adult workers. The arrangement had suited them both at the time, though Hank had gradually come to understand that he was being exploited rather than helped. 10 years had passed in a blur of backbreaking work, inadequate food, and the constant mockery of townspeople who viewed stable hands as barely a step above the animals they tended. The young men of Redemption Falls, sons of merchants and ranchers who had never known real hardship, took particular pleasure in tormenting Hank whenever their paths crossed. "Morning, stable boy," called out Richard Hartwell, the banker's son, as he rode up on his expensive thoroughbred. "Hope you've got that stall ready for Champion here. Try not to get your stink on him when you're brushing him down." Richard's companions, a group of wealthy young men who spent their days gambling and drinking while their fathers' money supported their idle lifestyles, laughed at the casual cruelty. Hank had learned long ago that responding to their taunts only made things worse, so he simply nodded and took Champion's reins without comment. "Look at him," sneered Thomas Whitfield, whose family owned the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties. 10 years of shoveling shit, and he still hasn't figured out how to do anything else. "My father says stable boys are born, not made. Some people are just meant to serve their betters." The mockery continued as Hank led Champion into the stable, but he had developed an internal shield that protected him from the worst of their verbal abuse. What they didn't know, what no one in Redemption Falls knew, was that Hank had spent the past decade secretly educating himself through books, borrowed from the town library, and careful observation of the business dealings that took place around him. Old Brennan had been surprised to discover that his supposedly ignorant stable boy could read and write with impressive skill, but he had sworn Hank to secrecy about this ability. "People expect certain things from stable hands," Brennan had explained. "If they know you're educated, they'll think you're getting above your station and make your life even harder." The advice had proven sound, allowing Hank to move through town as an invisible observer, while wealthy men discussed business deals and financial opportunities in his presence, assuming he was too stupid to understand or remember what he heard. Over the years, Hank had accumulated an extensive knowledge of local commerce, property values, and investment opportunities that would have impressed the most sophisticated businessmen. More importantly, Hank had been secretly accumulating capital through a method that would have shocked everyone who mocked him. 5 years earlier, he had discovered that old Brennan kept detailed but disorganized records of the stable's finances, and Hank had gradually taken over the bookkeeping duties while his employer focused on horse trading. What Brennan didn't realize was that his stable hand had been implementing subtle improvements in business operations, negotiating better rates with feed suppliers, implementing more efficient work schedules, and identifying opportunities to expand services to wealthy clients who valued convenience over cost. The stable's profits had increased substantially under Hank's quiet management, and Brennan had been generous enough to share a small percentage of those increased earnings with the young man he still thought of as his ignorant but hard-working employee. Hank had saved every penny of his earnings with obsessive discipline, hiding the growing sum in a leather pouch buried beneath the floorboards of the tiny room above the stable where he slept. The amount had grown slowly but steadily, $5, then 10, then 20, accumulating month by month until the pouch contained nearly $200. But Hank's true financial breakthrough had come through an unlikely friendship with Ezra Goldman, the elderly proprietor of Redemption Falls' only bank. Goldman was a shrewd businessman who had made his fortune through careful investments and an uncanny ability to identify undervalued opportunities before others recognized their potential. The banker had first noticed Hank 3 years earlier, when the stable hand had been reading a complex financial treatise during a rare break from his duties. Goldman had been intrigued by the contrast between Hank's shabby appearance and his obvious intellectual capabilities, and he had struck up a conversation that revealed the depth of the young man's self-education. "You're wasting your potential mucking out stalls," Goldman had told Hank during one of their clandestine meetings at the bank after hours. "With your intelligence and work ethic, you could be running businesses rather than just working in them." Goldman had become Hank's mentor and secret business partner, teaching him about banking, investments, and the mechanisms of wealth creation that separated the rich from the poor. Most importantly, the banker had allowed Hank to make small investments using his accumulated savings, turning $200 into $500, then $1,000, and eventually into amounts that would have shocked everyone who viewed him as a worthless stable hand. "The secret to building wealth," Goldman had explained, "is understanding that money is a tool rather than a goal. People who are born wealthy often squander their inheritance because they've never learned to view capital as something to be deployed strategically rather than simply spent on luxuries." Their partnership had been formalized through a series of legal documents that Goldman had carefully prepared and filed away in his bank's secure vault. On paper, Hank Morrison was a silent partner in several of Goldman's most successful ventures, including a silver mine, a freight company, and substantial real estate holdings in the rapidly growing town. "When the time is right," Goldman had promised, "we'll reveal your true position. But for now, it's better that people continue to underestimate you. A man who is invisible can see opportunities that others miss." That morning, as Hank finished brushing down Richard Hartwell's expensive thoroughbred, he had no idea that the time Goldman had spoken of was about to arrive in the most dramatic fashion possible. The sound of urgent hoofbeats drew Hank's attention to the street, where Dr. Samuel Morrison was riding hard toward the bank with obvious distress written across his weathered face. Something was clearly wrong, and the doctor's destination suggested that Ezra Goldman was involved. Hank's instincts, honed by years of observation and careful attention to the undercurrents of town life, told him that whatever was happening at the bank would prove significant. He quickly finished his work and made his way toward the cluster of people gathering outside the financial institution, keeping to the edges of the crowd where a stable hand's presence would go unnoticed. Through the bank's windows, he could see Dr. Morrison kneeling beside a figure slumped over a desk, and Hank's heart sank as he recognized Ezra Goldman's distinctive white hair. The banker, who had been his mentor and partner, appeared to have suffered some kind of medical crisis, and the doctor's grim expression suggested the outcome was not hopeful. Within minutes, the terrible news spread through the gathered crowd. Ezra Goldman had suffered a massive heart attack and died at his desk, apparently while working on some important financial documents. The shock rippled through Redemption Falls like a stone thrown into still water, as people realized that one of the town's most important citizens had suddenly departed. For Hank, the news hit with particular force, not just because he had lost a friend and mentor, but because he understood that Goldman's death might expose the secret business partnership they had maintained for 3 years. The legal documents in the bank's vault would eventually be discovered, and when they were, the entire town would learn that their despised stable hand was actually one of the community's wealthiest individuals. 3 days after Ezra Goldman's funeral, the town's prominent citizens gathered at the bank for the reading of his will and the examination of his business records. The deceased banker had been unmarried and without direct heirs, making the disposition of his substantial estate a matter of intense speculation and concern among those who had borrowed from him or conducted business through his institution. Judge Harrison Mitchell presided over the proceedings with the stern authority that had made him respected throughout the territory. Beside him sat Malcolm Prescott, a lawyer from Denver who had been Goldman's attorney for decades, and Harold Brennan, who had been appointed by the court to serve as temporary administrator of the bank's affairs until ownership could be properly established. The gathering included every important person in Redemption Falls: Mayor Thomas Whitfield, Sheriff William Crane, the leading merchants and ranchers, and most prominently Richard Hartwell Sr., whose family had substantial deposits in Goldman's bank and who hoped to acquire control of the institution through strategic political maneuvering. What none of them expected was the presence of Henry Morrison, the stable hand who had slipped into the back of the room and positioned himself where he could observe the proceedings without drawing attention. His worn work clothes and the lingering smell of the stable marked him as someone who clearly didn't belong among the assembled elite. But no one had the energy to expel him before the proceedings began. "Gentlemen," Judge Mitchell began, his voice carrying across the crowded bank, "we are here to examine the late Ezra Goldman's business records and determine the proper disposition of his assets. Mr. Prescott will guide us through the relevant documents." The lawyer opened a thick ledger that contained Goldman's most important financial records, organized with the meticulous care that had characterized the banker's approach to all business matters. The first pages detailed the bank's assets, liabilities, and the various investments that Goldman had made using both his own capital and depositors' money. "The bank itself appears to be in excellent financial condition," Prescott announced, clearly relieved by this discovery. "All deposits are fully secured, and the institution's reserves exceed the minimum requirements by a comfortable margin." This news was greeted with audible sighs of relief from the assembled businessmen, who had been worried that Goldman's death might have exposed financial irregularities that would threaten their own assets. The examination continued through pages of routine transactions, loans, and investments that held no particular surprises. Then Prescott turned to a section of the ledger that had been sealed with red wax and marked with a notation in Goldman's distinctive handwriting: "Partnership agreements and private investments." The lawyer carefully broke the seal and began examining documents that made his eyes widen with surprise. "This is unexpected," Prescott muttered, clearly struggling to process what he was reading. "Judge Mitchell, I think you should see this immediately." The judge took the documents and studied them carefully, his expression shifting from curiosity to amazement as he absorbed the information they contained. "Gentlemen, it appears that Mr. Goldman had a business partner whose involvement in his various enterprises was far more substantial than anyone suspected." Richard Hartwell Sr. leaned forward with obvious interest. "A partner? Who is this person, and why was their involvement kept secret?" Prescott consulted the documents again before responding. "According to these records, the partnership was formalized 3 years ago and has been remarkably profitable for both parties. The partner in question currently holds substantial equity in Goldman's silver mine, freight company, and real estate holdings." Mayor Whitfield's face showed his growing impatience with the lawyer's careful revelations. "For God's sake, Prescott, who is this mysterious partner?" The lawyer looked around the room as if searching for someone, his eyes eventually landing on the shabby figure standing at the back. "According to these documents, properly signed and witnessed, Mr. Goldman's partner is Henry Morrison." The announcement was greeted with absolute silence, as every person in the room turned to stare at the stable hand who had somehow been named as partner to one of the territory's wealthiest bankers. Then the silence exploded into chaos as multiple people began shouting questions and accusations simultaneously. "That's impossible!" Richard Hartwell Sr. declared, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. Goldman couldn't have been in partnership with a stable boy. These documents must be forgeries. The handwriting is definitely Goldman's, Prescott replied calmly. The signatures have been properly witnessed by 3 independent parties, including myself. Judge Mitchell pounded his gavel to restore order, though his own expression showed that he was struggling to process this extraordinary revelation. Mr. Morrison, would you please approach the bench? Hank walked slowly through the crowd of hostile faces, acutely aware that his appearance in worn work clothes and with stable dirt still under his fingernails made him look like exactly what everyone assumed he was, an ignorant laborer who had no business being associated with sophisticated financial dealings. Mr. Morrison, the judge said, his voice carrying a mixture of skepticism and curiosity, are you aware of these partnership agreements? Yes, sir, Hank replied, his voice steady despite the hostile atmosphere. Mr. Goldman approached me 3 years ago after discovering that I had been educating myself through extensive reading and careful observation of business practices. He believed I had potential that was being wasted in the stable. Ridiculous. Mayor Whitfield interjected. Stable hands don't have the intelligence or education to be business partners with successful bankers. Hank met the mayor's contemptuous stare with quiet dignity. With respect, sir, intelligence isn't determined by occupation or social standing. Mr. Goldman understood that, even if others don't. Prescott consulted the documents again before addressing the skeptical audience. According to these records, Mr. Morrison made initial investments totaling $200, which he had saved from his earnings at Brennan's stable. Those investments under Goldman's guidance have grown substantially over the past 3 years. How substantially? Asked Sheriff Crane, clearly intrigued despite his obvious doubts about the situation. The lawyer's answer sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Based on these ledgers, Mr. Morrison's current holdings are valued at approximately $47,000, making him one of the wealthiest individuals in Redemption Falls. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt, transforming the despised stable hand into a figure of considerable financial power. Richard Hartwell Jr., who had been lounging near the back of the room, looked as if he might be sick at the realization that the man he had been tormenting for a decade was actually wealthier than his own family. This can't be legal, Thomas Whitfield insisted, though his voice carried less certainty than before. There must be some way to contest these agreements. Judge Mitchell examined the partnership documents with the careful attention of someone trained in legal intricacies. I'm afraid everything appears to be in perfect order. The agreements were properly executed, witnessed, and filed. Mr. Morrison's ownership stakes in these various enterprises are legally binding. The stable hand is secretly wealthy, but can he survive the fury of those he's outsmarted? Subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to see how Hank claims his rightful place in society. The revelation of Hank Morrison's secret wealth created an earthquake that shook the social foundations of Redemption Falls. The stable hand who had been mocked for a decade was suddenly revealed as one of the town's most substantial property owners, and the cognitive dissonance this created among the community's elite was both amusing and uncomfortable to observe. The immediate aftermath of the bank meeting saw various reactions from the townspeople who had participated in or tolerated Hank's humiliation over the years. Some, like Sheriff Crane, showed grudging respect for the young man's intelligence and determination. Others, particularly the Hartwell and Whitfield families, reacted with fury and denial, convinced that some kind of fraud must have been perpetrated. There has to be an explanation, Richard Hartwell Sr. insisted during an emergency meeting of the town council. Goldman must have been suffering from mental deterioration, or the Morrison boy somehow manipulated him into these agreements. Judge Mitchell, who had completed his examination of Goldman's records and found them meticulously organized and legally sound, shook his head with finality. I've reviewed every document, interviewed the witnesses, and consulted with banking experts from Denver. Everything is legitimate. Ezra Goldman was in full possession of his faculties, and Henry Morrison's investments were made with his own money earned through honest labor. The judge's ruling was supported by additional evidence that emerged during the following week. Old Brennan, initially shocked by the revelation about his stable hand's secret wealth, confirmed that Hank had indeed been saving his earnings with unusual discipline and had taken over much of the stable's bookkeeping without being asked. "I thought he was just being helpful," Brennan admitted during his testimony before the judge. "I didn't realize he was actually improving my business operations and increasing profits." Looking back, I can see that the stable's success over the past 5 years is largely due to Hank's management, even though I was too blind to recognize it at the time. More surprisingly, several other business owners came forward with similar stories of Hank's quiet competence and helpful suggestions that had improved their operations. The blacksmith revealed that Hank had designed a more efficient workflow for his shop. The general store owner admitted that Hank had suggested inventory management improvements that increased profits. And even the hotel proprietor acknowledged that the stable hand had provided valuable advice about customer service. "We all saw him as just the stable boy," the hotel owner confessed, "but he was actually observing our businesses and thinking about ways to improve them. He never asked for credit or compensation. He just helped because that's his nature." These testimonials gradually shifted public opinion from skepticism to amazement as people realized that the young man they had dismissed as worthless had actually been the most observant and intelligent person in town. The mockery that had defined Hank's experience in Redemption Falls began to transform into something approaching respect. Though the transition was awkward for everyone involved, the Hartwell and Whitfield families, however, refused to accept the new reality. Richard Hartwell Sr. filed multiple legal challenges attempting to invalidate the partnership agreements, claiming fraud, undue influence, and mental incompetence on Goldman's part. Each challenge was systematically rejected by Judge Mitchell, who grew increasingly impatient with their transparent attempts to deny Hank his rightful property. "Your Honor," Malcolm Prescott argued during one of these hearings, "my clients are simply trying to protect the integrity of Redemption Falls' business community. Allowing a stable hand to claim ownership of substantial enterprises sets a dangerous precedent." Judge Mitchell's response was sharp and unequivocal. The dangerous precedent would be allowing people to deny legitimate business agreements simply because they don't approve of one party's social status. Mr. Morrison's partnership with Ezra Goldman was legal, profitable, and based on merit rather than privilege. That's exactly the kind of precedent this territory should be establishing. The final blow to the Hartwell family's campaign came when Hank exercised his ownership rights in Goldman's bank by calling a shareholders' meeting. As majority owner following Goldman's death and with controlling interest in the institution, Hank had the legal authority to make significant decisions about the bank's management and direction. The meeting was held in the same room where Hank's partnership had been revealed weeks earlier, but this time he stood at the head of the table rather than lurking in the back. He had purchased proper business attire and had taken the time to visit a barber, transforming his appearance from shabby stable hand to respectable businessman. "Gentlemen," Hank began, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment, "I want to thank you all for attending this meeting. I know my ownership of this bank is controversial, but I hope to demonstrate that merit matters more than background." He outlined his vision for the bank's future with impressive clarity and detail, proposing expansion into underserved communities, more favorable loan terms for small farmers and merchants, and investment strategies that would benefit the entire region rather than just the wealthy elite. The proposals were sound, thoughtful, and demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of banking operations that surprised even the most skeptical attendees. Richard Hartwell Sr. made one final attempt to undermine Hank's credibility. "Mr. Morrison, all of this sounds very impressive, but you must admit that you lack the social standing necessary to command respect in the business community. Who will take seriously a banker who spent the last decade shoveling manure? Hank's response was calm but devastating. Mr. Hartwell, I spent the last decade learning valuable lessons about hard work, humility, and the importance of treating all people with dignity regardless of their station. Those lessons have served me better than any privileged upbringing could have. He paused before delivering the final blow. Furthermore, I should mention that I've been reviewing the bank's loan records, and I've discovered several interesting patterns in the loans made to your family. It appears that many of these loans were made under terms significantly more favorable than those offered to other borrowers, and that some of the collateral requirements were waived despite standard banking practices. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun, and Richard Hartwell Sr.'s face went pale as he realized that Hank had discovered evidence of the preferential treatment that Goldman had extended to his family over the years. I'm not suggesting any illegality, Hank continued, but I am putting the bank's board on notice that such favoritism will not continue under my management. All borrowers will be treated equally, regardless of their social status or family connections. The meeting ended with a decisive vote of confidence in Hank's leadership, supported even by several people who had initially opposed his ascension to power. His combination of knowledge, fairness, and vision had won over enough skeptics to give him the authority he needed to remake the bank according to his principles. In the months that followed, Hank Morrison's transformation from mocked stable hand to respected businessman became complete. His management of the bank proved remarkably successful, his investments continued to grow, and his commitment to treating all people fairly earned him genuine respect throughout the territory. Old Brennan offered to sell Hank the stable, recognizing that his former employee had outgrown the need for such work. But Hank surprised everyone by accepting the offer and then immediately hiring 3 young orphans to work there, paying them fair wages and encouraging their education. Everyone deserves the same chance I got, Hank explained to the judge, who had become something of a mentor following Goldman's death. The only difference between me and those boys is that I was lucky enough to meet Ezra Goldman. I want to be that person for others. The Hartwell family eventually accepted the new reality, though Richard Jr.'s encounters with Hank were forever marked by the humiliation of having mocked someone who turned out to be his social superior. Thomas Whitfield grudgingly acknowledged Hank's business acumen and eventually sought his advice on ranch management issues. Most importantly, Hank never forgot the lessons learned during his years of mockery and hard labor. He remained humble, hard-working, and committed to the principle that a person's worth should be measured by their character and abilities, rather than their circumstances of birth. The story of the stable hand who became a banker spread throughout the territory, inspiring other young people to educate themselves and work toward better futures, regardless of their starting positions. Hank Morrison's signature in Ezra Goldman's ledger had not just revealed hidden wealth. It had demonstrated that America's promise of opportunity was real for those with determination and vision. What an incredible journey from mockery to triumph. Hank proved that intelligence and determination can overcome any social barrier. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more amazing tales of success against all odds in the Old West. Share this inspiring story with everyone who believes in the power of hard work and self-improvement. What was your favorite moment in Hank's transformation from stable boy to banker? Let us know in the comments below.